This is the audio review of Chapter 5, Inflicting Inequalities, Prejudice and Discrimination in Everyday Life, from Identities and Inequalities. Okay, so the chapter starts with stereotypes, the building blocks of bigotry. So the chapter uses Walter Lippmann's definition of a stereotype, which is an oversimplified picture of the world, which helps us see the social environment in a more understandable way. It makes it more simplistic than reality. Stereotypes are an overgeneralized belief that a certain trait, behavior, attitude characterizes all members of some group. They often take the form of all blank are blank. Stereotypes affect our understandings and often become snap judgments after reading people for their social identities. They cause us to overgeneralize groups, which obscures complexities and differences within groups that reflect the actual social world. So when it comes to the normality of stereotypes, our brains like dichotomy, good or bad, strong or weak, us or them. We stereotype people based on assumed group assumptions. Stereotypes are also very resistant to change and tend to persist over time. They set expectations for us, and people still believe them despite evidence. It's a sort of confirmation bias, which is when we tend to interpret new evidence to fit our existing beliefs. This works when you ignore the evidence that contradicts your bias. So for example, if someone believes in the stereotype that women are bad drivers, they can say their experiences confirm their bias, when in reality, when a woman cuts them off in traffic, this person thinks, "See, I knew it, women are bad drivers." While a man cuts this person off and they think, "What a jerk." But they don't tally that experience in a mental column challenging their confirmation bias. So basically, people notice things that confirm the stereotypical thinking while simultaneously ignoring when evidence contradicts those stereotypes. There's also the negativity of positive stereotypes. Even the best of positive stereotypes can be harmful. Some people argue that they are harmless, but in reality, they're not complementary or helpful as some claim. They're still important to confront because they uphold essentialist thinking that connects people to notions of biological inevitability. So one example is the model minority idea of Asian Americans. And while Asian Americans statistically have been more successful at assimilation, the expectations and resentment that come with living your life in the shadow of the model minority stereotype is very limiting and oppressive. The quote from the Asian American college student in the chapter expertly points out how it's not a compliment, it's an insult. This assumption of the model minority downplays the real problems that Asian Americans continue to face in all areas of public and private life. To ignore the struggles of Asian Americans by instead promoting the stereotype that their success is natural and expected is problematic. Also, Asian is a pan-ethnic category, and focusing on the whole obscures the significant in-group differences. So we're talking about dozens of groups, all supposedly the same, when, for example, the chapter points out that while most Indian and Pakistani adults completed bachelor's degrees, while at the same time, most Cambodian adults never finished high school. So by focusing on the large pan-ethnic group, we miss the more marginal within-group experience, as the most privileged of the group are the ones who are focused on. So the real issue is even a supposed positive stereotype is still connected on a continuum of racist ideas in the culture that blame both social success and social failure on the biological inevitability of race. Okay, moving on to the lady and the natural good mother. So it's also commonly believed that women are kinder, gentler, and more nurturing, and more refined than men. So when women step out of this expectation, they're policed for violating gender norms. For example, when Serena Williams got in a fight with a chair umpire during the US Open, and his point penalties shifted the pace of the match, she was villainized for her behavior as being aggressive. But shortly after, people started pointing out how men like John McEnroe were known and arguably celebrated for their aggressive reactions to tennis officials. And he now makes money being a commentator criticizing officials for bad calls in the matches. So the idea that women are gentle and kind are not positive, because when a woman steps out of those boundaries, there's cultural punishments for violating those expectations. Another downside of the women are nice stereotype is that when women are professional, they're perceived differently than men who have the same qualities. When it comes to these stereotypes, the most lasting is the assumption that women are hormonally predisposed to be better parents than men, due to a supposed maternal instinct, and as a result, women are judged by a different set of parenting expectations than men are. So you can see the links between these beliefs and state control over women's bodies, such as limiting women's access to legal abortion. If you think women are natural mothers, then women who do not have children or choose not to have kids are suspect or pitied. Ironically, even though we reduce women to being wombs, becoming mothers in American society can have real consequences for women financially. Even though society promotes it and says it cares about family values, yet there's no paid family leave. We do not have support for families such as subsidized quality childcare. No single-payer healthcare and free or affordable college access that's available in many other developed nations that takes the pressure off of families to provide these care over time. So women face lost wages and even the mommy gap, which disadvantages women's earnings and ability to find and retain employment. Because of sexist assumptions that women are primarily caregivers, women may also lose opportunities for promotion and higher paid jobs, as being a good mother is seen as a conflict with being a good worker. Those who can stay late, work weekends or off hours are often seen as more dedicated, when that's hard for parents with young children to do. And women still provide the majority of care to children. Without daycare support in a workplace or large-scale subsidized daycare, women are disadvantaged. The book also looks at the intersections, the strong Black woman, this historical and cultural image of Black strength, this stoic, tireless, deeply caring, invulnerable woman who perseveres through adversity. So she's this embodiment of courage and devotion, right? Helping people in need. This stereotype has evolved over many years from that of the mammy, dating back to slavery, who was presented as a strong, poor Black woman who was fierce, but not because of her intellect and heart, but because she was socially constructed as subhuman and animal-like. These women were constructed in opposition to white femininity that was seen as delicate, morally superior, upper class, this white woman who is the product of a refined and civilized lifestyle. The characterization of Black female strength is a double-edged sword that defends the current stratified social order because it obscures Black women's continuing experience of suffering, desperation, and anger. So if women live up to the expectation that they often must neglect their own feelings in order to be strong for others, or if she admits any weakness, she risks being disregarded for not living up to these stereotypical expectations. Prejudice is an attitude with an emotional evaluative bias. So prejudice is when stereotypes become the basis of belief in rigid, unfavorable judgments and feelings about members of another group. Prejudices change because they're socially constructed. And so that means they're going to be affected by the time period and the values of those times. So in the text, they discuss how specific historical events can also shape prejudice. So when you think of what image comes to mind when you hear the word terrorist, right? Is it the Oklahoma City bomber? The white ranchers that took over a Federal Reserve? See, I grew up at a different time than most of you. So I grew up in an America where the bad guy in every movie was a Soviet terrorist, a Hans Gruber, if you will. But social meanings change as events shift our definitions and interpretations. In modern American society, the stereotype of a terrorist is a person of Middle Eastern descent, especially after 9/11, when the prejudice manifested in multiple hate crime attacks on people perceived to be Middle Eastern, as well as targeting mosques for domestic terrorism from white supremacist terrorists, along with state surveillance and monitoring of entire Muslim communities. There was even the birther issue raised by Donald Trump, alleging that not only was Obama from another country, therefore not a valid president, that he's Muslim and not a Christian, a secret Muslim. It's akin to asking a person of color where they're from, which Trump also did at congresswomen known as the Squad, when he told them to, quote, go back to the countries that they came from rather than, quote, loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States how to run the government. Only Ilhan Omar of the four women was born in another country, in Somalia, while Rashida Tlaib is from Detroit, Ayanna Pressley is from Cincinnati, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was born in the Bronx. So this is the same vein as the racist birtherism, a racist idea of white supremacy that the only people who are real Americans are white, and everyone else gets the question, where are you from? No, but really, where are you from? So there's also this assumption of normality is white, especially for presidents. It's also male, heterosexual, and married, typically with children, right? And again, until Obama, white. So there have been many high-profile controversies in recent years centered on prejudice, and even some backlash to these situations, such as when conservative talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh lose sponsors after backlash to his racist remarks. The book gives the example of the former Clippers owner drama when his racist remarks were leaked to TMZ. So this just shows that there's a collective movement against these kinds of actions, but prejudice itself is still a significant issue in modern life. Okay, moving on to the politics of racial prejudice, the Obama effect or the Obama backlash. This is something I'm fascinated by, as I like to study politics. What seems to have happened? Many thought his election meant the end of racial prejudice and inequality, the beginning of a new era, a post-racial society. What resulted in the Obama era was two different camps on completely opposite ends of the spectrum, yet both promoting racism. One is the birther folks that we just reviewed, and the other are the colorblind racists, those who allege that since a mixed-race person became president, those who face structural barriers to achievement are just pulling the race card or complaining due to their own shortcomings. Not only is this ignorant as it disregards the structural barriers and historical legacies of inequality, but it also uses token examples of people who've overcome adversity to try to argue that the struggles never existed in the first place. There's also gender and sexual prejudice. So some prejudices change over time, but one that stayed relatively unchanged is that of gender prejudice. Over the years, women have been constructed as passive, emotional, fickle, and dependent on men. It is expressed in society both overtly and subtly through physical domination, condescending comments, sabotage, and exploitation. Some of these come from a hostile place, but there's also others that are more benevolent, trying to take care of women because they're considered inferior. Also, when it comes to sexual prejudice or heterosexism, which places homosexuals as low on the social ladder and historically constructed them as abnormal, deviant, or ultimately dangerous to the values of society. For many years, gays and lesbians have faced prejudice and discrimination around the world, facing rejection, ridicule, and have been targeted on moral, religious, criminal, and psychiatric grounds. As conditions improved in some places, the reality remains that 2.7 billion people live in countries where homosexuality is a crime, punishable by imprisonment, beatings, or even death. While conditions in the United States have improved since the 1970s, the work is not done, and there's still a lot of anti-gay and anti-lesbian stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Many states have attempted to pass what are called religious freedom laws, which are smokescreens for legal protection for anti-gay and anti-lesbian discrimination, such as the baker refusing to bake a cake for a gay wedding. So what's interesting from a sociological perspective is how anti-gay bias differs across society. For instance, research finds that those with the most prejudice are older, less educated, living in rural parts of the country, such as the South and Midwest. And research also finds more prejudice in people who do not personally know gays and lesbians, which makes sense, as when you do not know anyone of a marginalized group, you can be more susceptible to the stereotypes and the bias in the culture because you have no knowledge or experiences to refute it. Such as, well, my friend Paul isn't like that stereotype, or my coworker, or my cousin, or whoever can be a site for people's understanding to shift against societal stigmas and stereotypes. Okay, moving on to prejudice, privilege, and ideologies of inferiority. With so many different group identities, we find nearly as many prejudices. But not all prejudice is created equally. For instance, the book example of a lesbian who hates heterosexuals as just as prejudiced as a heterosexual who hates homosexuals ignores the historical and cultural foundations of prejudice, the differences in power and privilege between those groups, and the different consequences that depend on who is expressing prejudice towards whom. Also, when we focus on an individual person's racism, such as Donald Trump, as he's always doubling down and reminding us that he's racist, if we focus too much on that, we fail to see the larger historical and cultural foundations of prejudice. Sociologists want to understand how individual prejudice becomes a structural phenomenon. So there's factors involved, right? A belief in innate difference, right? Those people aren't like me. And those feelings of superiority, that those people aren't as good as me. Herbert Bloomer added two more to to this criteria. Entitlement, the belief that one's group has a rightful claim to certain privileges or advantages. And when those feelings of entitlement combine with a suspicion of a subordinate group that covets the privileges of the dominant group, the result is prejudice. What's important about these feelings, difference, superiority, entitlement, suspicion, is that they combine to reflect the hierarchical positioning of groups in society. Okay, so preserving inequality. When it comes to race and biological weakness, in the 18th and 19th century, most white people believed in the biological truth of a racial hierarchy, and these are those founding fathers, the people we look up to, the people we revere, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, right? Darwin, Abraham Lincoln, for example. They all believed in the natural inferiority of those who were not seen as white. It was accepted in science, in medicine, as fact. All research has found more within race variation than between race variation, whether you're looking at physical or mental aptitude. Despite evidence, beliefs about racial inferiority always serve to benefit the dominant group. There are also supposed moral justifications for unequal treatment, such as the myth of the black male rapist that has been used for generations to justify segregation and lynching. No matter the logic, what we're looking at is victim blaming, blaming an individual for their lot in life without the larger social context. This connects back to the ideology of eugenics, which was supported by elites in Western society, making its way into the practice of medicine and trying to reinforce a white supremacist hierarchy of race relations that sees ethnic and racial minorities as inherently inferior. And when it comes to gender and biological inevitability, like race that supports this ideology of biological inevitability, so does gender prejudice, this idea that it's biological. The information and roles about women were historically constructed in opposition to men's roles, almost as a way to distinguish what a man is not, right? Creating that bifurcated ideology. So it was even thought that a woman educating herself would destroy her reproductive organs. And it's important to understand the context of that time period when women were legally segregated from educational opportunities. There's a social ideology there to try to justify that unequal treatment. Nowadays, women on average are outpacing men in graduation rates with bachelor's degrees, and their reproductive organs have not been damaged in this process. So the ideology connects to the time, but like I said before, gender as biological inevitability has remained very persistent in the culture. The idea that a woman is more biologically nurturing can be seen in women's expected roles in society and in the institution of family, but also in what professions are dominated by women, such as teaching, nursing, daycare providers, maids, social workers, etc. They tend to be extensions of a gendered assumption about the proper roles for women. A large problem with depicting masculinity and femininity as natural biological phenomenon is that it confuses sex and gender. We live in a social world, and while biology is important, things beyond genes and hormones shape social behaviors. Also, as we discussed with similarities and differences, we love to focus on the differences when in reality, as a species, we are not that sexually dimorphic. We have a lot of things biologically in common across sexes. There are differences, but there's actually a lot of variation within sexes as well. So racial transparency, the experience of having no color. This is just when you're the racial norm of society, not needing to think about race because you don't face any sort of racial discrimination. So this is that invisibility of whiteness. It doesn't mean that white people are never discussed. They are, but instead they're the default setting for society. If you turn on TV, if you pick up a magazine, you're going to see white people. When whites talk about each other, they're just simply talking about people. So when it comes to these stereotypes, even when stereotypes form about white people, they reflect their privileged status in society. So many assume whiteness means the absence of culture because it's hegemonic, but others define them in opposition to others, meaning regular music versus Latin music. Also, whiteness was often signified by commodities in the research in the book, such as Kleenex, mayonnaise, Wonder Bread, right? Which links them to larger economy, unlike other races. So when you look at the intersection of wealthy white men and perceptions of race, understandings about the most privileged are still relatively unknown. For rich men studied in the research from the text, who were very segregated financially from the rest of society, they remembered their first experiences with people of color being their family's servants, putting the assumption in their heads of their social role and the social roles of others. Their perceptions have everything to do with those interactions. They also reported not thinking that much about their race. Interesting is the contrast they reported in thinking of whiteness in terms of privilege, but also the perception that they're now the victims in a multiracial society that's trying to take away their power, that they're facing discrimination and not the beneficiaries of social inequality anymore. So there's also the issue, outside of these concepts of whiteness, is within group prejudice or colorism. Most people think of prejudice as bigotry between groups, but due to the social messages of hegemony, many people learn to internalize the messages of larger society, i.e. white supremacy. So colorism is at play, which is defined as skin color prejudice. And this has come about as a result of colonial America and the consequences of the white supremacist hierarchy and value system of the slave era. During slavery, those who were light-skinned were thought to be more intelligent than their dark-skinned peers and were given preferential work assignments. Later, in the mid-20th century, the brown bag test was used to limit membership in some African American churches, social clubs, fraternities, and other organizations. Also, studies have found that lighter-skinned blacks have higher educational attainment, more prestigious occupations, higher annual incomes, less contact with the criminal justice system, and greater likelihoods of holding elected office. So the preference remains today and frames dating experiences as ideals of beauty are connected to white supremacy. So women of color are often considered more attractive depending on how closely they reflect European features, skin tones, and hair. Research in the book explores the internalization of these cultural images and how these cultural ideals affect internalized ideas of self-esteem and self-worth. Colorism is not limited to Black communities in the U.S. One of the most popular beauty products around the world is skin whitening or skin bleaching creams that can be extremely hazardous to one's health. As skin tone is used in immediate snap judgments, it's also connected to ideas of higher status throughout many societies. For instance, the severe discrimination faced by different indigenous communities. The book discusses this phenomenon in Mexico as an example. So discrimination is defined in the text as the unfair treatment of people based on some identifiable social characteristic, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or class. Personal discrimination is unfair treatment of certain groups by individual people. This type of discrimination includes biased treatment in interactions, avoidance, exclusion, and threats or acts of violence. Personal discrimination is what gets the most attention in the media and the larger culture. But quiet bias is also an issue. Some discrimination is subtler than others. Sometimes these microaggressions are there to make people feel that others have hostility towards them, but they don't engage in these open acts of discrimination in the same ways as previous generations because of laws or customs against that kind of open discrimination. So the so-called timid bigot does not openly discriminate because they're not allowed to do so. If they are, once again granted a pass, they will return to overt bigotry. The feelings at the root of quiet bias does not need to be hatred. It can simply be discomfort or fear. Quiet bias is distinguished by the sanitary coded language that serves as a dog whistle to those with quiet bias. The book examples were terms like inner city or welfare. And I would add to that list hoodlums, thugs, looters, which is used so much in the media and politics in regards to Black Lives Matter protests and uprisings after police brutality and police murders of unarmed citizens. Another prominent one, a blast from the past from the Nixon era, reborn thanks to Trump, is the coded language of law and order, which signals to people with racial anxieties. So the words themselves are not using racial slurs. They're supposedly neutral of race. Another hallmark of this kind of quiet bias is the shift from explaining inequality as a result of biological differences. Now it's seen as a matter of cultural differences or national identity. The cultural poverty argument that ignores these structural factors and instead blames communities for being marginal The idea is that if poor people weren't such bad people, they wouldn't be poor. It's their lifestyles that are to blame, and not history, cultural prejudice, or, these structural inequities. So the enduring importance of race is just a factor in American society. Some argue that race is no longer an issue because of overt racism of the past is somewhat gone, right? Such as segregation laws. Even though class and race are still strongly related, people of color are more affluent sometimes, right? Or some people don't suffer as much discrimination as the book. Yet people are still facing active discrimination on a daily basis, right? The book example, "You remind me of my former maid," said to a Georgetown law professor that was a woman of color. So more often, people of color are asked to speak on behalf of their entire race. Many argue that their job is stressful because of the discrimination they face, as their white coworkers treat them disrespectfully, more so than the actual stressors of the jobs that they're working. So research in the book explored the experiences of Black professionals and managers. They illustrate the scope and scale of issues that people face in the workplace. Also, the everyday lived experiences of being distrusted, being considered deviant, that has impacts on people. And as we'll talk about later, on people's health. So regardless of attaining higher social class status, and, having that social value that's supposed to come with a higher social class status, this is not a shield against racial and ethnic discrimination for people of color. Race is clearly still an issue in American society. All right, looking at the intersections of race, class, gender, and everyday social encounters, the book uses the example of the code of the street to explain how these intersectional ideas structure people's lived experiences. In the book, he finds that residents of both poor and wealthy neighborhoods are incapable of distinguishing law-abiding young Black men from criminally involved young Black men. Instead, people rely on stereotypes, that whites are middle-class, law-abiding, and trustworthy, and that young Black men are poor, crime-prone, and dangerous. In response to these stereotypes, more affluent Black men have to find ways to disarm people or put them at ease so they can counter the negative assumptions that they face from others based on their skin color. So this requires an enormous amount of effort and places the responsibility for social order on these men, as they feel compelled to put strangers at ease so they can go about living their lives. When it comes to power and personal discrimination, the book explores some of the ways that gendered expectations and values have disadvantaged men, such as being drafted to go to war, or potentially child custody issues. And the book points out that while this may be the case, because men tend to dominate powerful social institutions, their discriminatory actions have more cultural legitimacy and more serious consequences than women's discrimination. In recent years, men have been sexualized more in the media, but the consequences for sexual objectification differ for men, as men often do not have to fear for their own safety because someone finds them attractive. Turning women into objects, seeing them as sex props and not people, opens the door to discrimination and really violence against women. When it comes to global ethnic violence, violent ethno-racial discrimination is not just an American thing, right? It's the rule, not the exception, all around the world. The book gives several examples of this. Racial and ethnic hatred costs the lives of millions of people around the world every year. Often this conflict is the result of past colonization, which is why it's so important for us to learn the people's history and see how the actions of the past have left scars that affect the world and international relationships today. When it comes to institutional discrimination is established laws, customs, policies, and practices that systematically reflect, produce inequalities in society, whether or not the individuals maintaining these practices have discriminatory intentions. They can only work to the advantage of those people who are privileged through these unequal systems, such as white people, men, heterosexuals, able-bodied people, young people, thin people, etc. So sometimes this is codified into law, such as during Jim Crow segregation or Japanese internment. Most of the time, institutional discrimination is more of a quiet bias, camouflaged as something else. So it may not be as apparent in design, but in consequence, it functions to marginalize those without social power. If all personal discrimination ended tomorrow, there would still be the problem of institutional discrimination.